The day Marcus Carter walked out of Hargrove Financial carrying a banker's box, 3 of his colleagues watched from the second-floor window and said nothing. Not one of them came down. He had worked at Hargrove for 11 days. That was what made it strange. 11 days was not long enough to make enemies. It was barely long enough to learn where the coffee was kept, to remember which elevator opened slowly, to figure out which meeting rooms had broken projectors. And yet by the end of those 11 days, Marcus Carter had been accused of leaking confidential client data to a competing firm, walked out of a termination meeting without being allowed to speak, and escorted to the lobby by a man from security who apologized twice on the way down and clearly meant it. Marcus placed the box in the back seat of his car, a coffee mug, a charging cable, a worn copy of the Canadian Securities Administrator's Handbook he always kept at his desk. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine. Then he took out his phone and made a call. The call lasted 4 minutes. His voice was level throughout. When it was over, he started the car and pulled out of the parking garage on Wellington Street into the gray October light of downtown Toronto. Behind him, Hargrove Financial had already begun to come apart at the seams. It would take another 3 weeks for everyone inside to understand exactly what had happened. But it had already started. Marcus Carter had spent 22 years in institutional finance. He had worked at 2 of the largest investment banks in the country before moving to a boutique advisory firm, and after that to the regulatory side, spending 7 years as a senior examiner with the Ontario Securities Commission. He had reviewed hundreds of firms. He had written the kind of reports that ended careers and shuttered offices and sent men in expensive suits to sit in uncomfortable chairs across from lawyers. He was 51 years old. He had a daughter named Fiona, who was finishing her 2nd year of law at Dalhousie, and a flat in the St. Lawrence Market neighborhood that smelled of old brick and coffee. He ran 5 kilometers most mornings along the waterfront, not because he enjoyed it particularly, but because a cardiologist had once looked at his family history and suggested it strongly. He had retired from the OSC 14 months earlier. Retired was perhaps not the right word. He had stepped back. He had wanted to take on a single private sector role, something that used his expertise without the institutional weight he had carried for years. When Hargrove Financial reached out through a recruiter, the pitch was straightforward. They needed someone internal compliance architectures to review of a planned expansion into Quebec. Contract work. 3 months, no management responsibilities, he had taken it. His first week at Hargrove was unremarkable in almost every respect. He was given a desk on the 14th floor, access to the firm's document management system, and a brief introduction to the 3 people who would be his primary contacts during the engagement: Sylvia Beaumont, the Director of Compliance; Derek Falconer, Deputy Head of Risk; and a man named Troy Ainsworth, who held the title of Senior Vice President, Strategic Operations, and who had a habit of speaking in declaratives that he seemed to mistake for insights. The 14th floor was organized around an open bullpen with glass-walled offices along the north side. It was quiet in the way that floors get quiet when people are being careful. Not productive quiet, but watchful quiet. Marcus noticed it on his 2nd day. He noticed it the way he had always noticed things in the firms he reviewed, not as a conclusion, but as a data point. He also noticed Petra Okonkwo was a compliance analyst, mid-30s, meticulous in her work and almost entirely invisible in the room. She sat 2 rows over from Marcus, arrived before anyone else each morning, and said very little in group settings. What she did say was always precise. In their first week, she and Marcus exchanged brief courtesies. He held the elevator. She thanked him. They introduced themselves. Nothing more. But Marcus had read enough files in his career to recognize the particular posture of someone who had learned to take up less space. Petra moved through the office like someone who had been told, in ways both direct and indirect, that her presence was provisional. He filed that observation and said nothing. On his 8th day at Hargrove, Marcus completed the first phase of the compliance review and shared his preliminary findings through the firm's shared document system. Standard practice. He had worked this way for years. Shared access meant the relevant team could begin preparing responses while he completed the final analysis. He shared the document with Sylvia Beaumont, Derek Falconer, and, at Troy Ainsworth's specific request, Troy himself. By the following morning, the document was gone from the system. Not deleted. Gone in a different way, replaced. A version with his name still on it, his formatting, his section headers, but the substantive findings altered. 2 significant regulatory gaps he had identified had been removed. A recommendation he had flagged as urgent had been rewritten into something soft and provisional, the kind of language that creates the impression of action without requiring any. Marcus did not say anything immediately. He made a copy of the original from his own backup and noted the metadata on both versions. The replacement had been made at 11:47 p.m., accessed through credentials that were not his own, though his name was attached to them. He recognized this particular technique. He had seen it before in a review he had conducted 8 years earlier at a firm in Calgary. That one had taken 6 months to unravel. He worked quietly through his 9th and 10th days, asking no questions that would signal what he had found, continuing the review as though nothing had changed. He spoke with Petra Okonkwo once during this time, in the small kitchen at the back of the floor, about nothing significant. She mentioned briefly that she had been passed over for a senior analyst position the previous spring, despite having led the project that the successful candidate had taken credit for. She said it without bitterness, in the tone of someone reporting weather. Marcus said he was sorry to hear that. She shrugged and said it was fine. He noted her name. On his 11th day, Sylvia Beaumont called him into a glass-walled meeting room at 10 in the morning. Derek Falconer was already there. A man Marcus had not met, introduced as the firm's head of IT security, sat to the side with a laptop. Sylvia told him that an internal review had flagged unusual data access patterns associated with his user credentials. Specifically, she said, client portfolio data from 2 accounts had been accessed outside normal business hours and transmitted to an external server. Marcus asked if he could see the access logs. Sylvia said that would not be possible at this stage of the process. Marcus asked whether the firm had engaged outside counsel. Sylvia said the decision had already been made. His engagement was being terminated, effective immediately, and the firm would be conducting its own review. If he cooperated, by which she meant if he signed a document she pushed across the table, the matter would not be referred to regulators. Marcus looked at the document. He looked at Sylvia Beaumont. He looked at Derek Falconer, who had not made eye contact once since Marcus walked in the room. He did not sign the document. He said very quietly that he would be taking the matter up through other channels. He stood up. He gathered his belongings from his desk, the coffee mug, the charging cable, the CSA handbook, and he walked to the elevator. The security guard who walked him out apologized twice. In the lobby, Marcus paused near the front desk long enough to send a short text message to a number he had not used in 14 months. Then he walked to his car, sat in the driver's seat, and made the 4-minute phone call. The call was to a woman named Helen Rourke. Helen Rourke was the Associate Deputy Minister responsible for financial sector oversight at the Ontario Ministry of Finance. She and Marcus had worked together for 3 years during his time at the OSC. She was precise, unhurried, and had the particular gift of people in her position for listening to what was not being said. Marcus told her what he had found. He told her about the altered document, the metadata, the access logs he had preserved, and the pattern he recognized from a previous engagement. He told her about the document Sylvia had asked him to sign. He told her about Petra Okonkwo and about a list of names he had quietly compiled over 11 days. Analysts and junior staff who had been passed over, reassigned, or quietly sidelined in ways that began, in aggregate, to look like a pattern rather than coincidence. Helen listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "How complete is what you have?" He said, "Complete enough." There was a pause. "Give me until Monday," she said. What Marcus Carter had not told Sylvia Beaumont, or Derek Falconer, or Troy Ainsworth, or anyone else at Hargrove Financial during his 11 days on the 14th floor, was who he was. Not who he was in the sense of his name or his professional history. Those were a matter of public record, and anyone who had looked carefully enough would have found them. But what he had not disclosed, because there was no professional obligation to do so and no one had asked, was his relationship to Hargrove Financial's parent entity. Hargrove Financial was a wholly owned subsidiary of Alderton Capital Group, a mid-sized institutional investment holding company headquartered in Calgary with offices in Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal. Alderton had been founded 26 years earlier by a man named Graydon Carter, Marcus's older brother, who had built it methodically over 2 decades before handing the chair of the board to their younger sister, Evelyn Carter Strauss, 4 years ago when his health began to decline. Marcus sat on Alderton's board of directors, had done so for 9 years. As a non-executive director, he had no operational role, no public profile within the company, and no presence in any of Hargrove's internal systems beyond the temporary credentials assigned to him as an external compliance consultant. He had taken the Hargrove engagement at Evelyn's request, at Graydon's suggestion, because there had been concerns at the board level, quiet, unspecified concerns of the kind that sometimes precede larger problems, about the firm's internal culture and compliance posture. The plan had not been for Marcus to conduct a covert investigation. It had simply been for him to look, with fresh eyes and without the distortions that came from being known. He had looked. What he had found was not what any of them had expected. On the Monday following his termination, Marcus received a call from Hargrove's general counsel, a careful man named Spencer Aldridge, who had been in the role for 6 years, and who sounded on the phone like someone reading from a script he had not fully endorsed. Spencer told him the firm was prepared to resolve the matter quickly and discreetly, and that there was a settlement figure they were prepared to offer. Marcus asked Spencer if he had yet spoken with anyone at the Ministry of Finance. There was a pause on Spencer's end. Marcus told him to convene a board meeting of Hargrove Financial's parent entity. He told him to contact the firm's external auditors and request that they place a preservation hold on all records from the 14th floor from the past 18 months. He told him to have IT security run an independent log review using credentials not associated with the current IT team. And then, before Spencer could respond, Marcus told him one more thing. He said, "I'm a director of Alderton Capital. I should have disclosed that when I came in. I didn't, and I'll answer for that. But I want you to understand what it means for where we are right now." There was a long silence. "I think," Spencer Aldridge said carefully, "that I need to make some calls." "Yes," Marcus said. "I think you do." The board meeting was held the following Wednesday at Alderton Capital's Toronto offices on Bay Street, in a room with tall windows that looked north toward Bloor. Marcus sat at the far end of the table. Evelyn Carter Strauss sat at the head. Around the table were 4 other board members, 2 of Hargrove's senior executives, Spencer Aldridge, and an external counsel who had been retained over the weekend. Sylvia Beaumont and Derek Falconer were not present. The IT security review, conducted by an independent forensics firm that Evelyn had retained on Friday morning, had confirmed what Marcus had documented. His credentials had been used without his knowledge to access client data. The access had originated from within the 14th floor, from a workstation logged into an account belonging to Troy Ainsworth. The document substitution had been performed by Derek Falconer, using a session token associated with Marcus's login that he had obtained through a phishing mechanism embedded in an internal email Marcus had opened on day 3. The data that had been transmitted externally had not gone to a competitor. It had gone to a private server registered to a numbered company in Alberta. The numbered company's beneficial ownership, as traced by the external counsel over the weekend, led back to a partnership that included, among its principals, both Troy Ainsworth and a former Hargrove client who had left the firm under disputed circumstances 2 years earlier. The picture that emerged was not about Marcus Carter. It had never been about Marcus Carter. He had simply arrived at an inconvenient time and noticed things quickly enough that he had become a liability to be managed rather than a consultant to be ignored. The board authorized Evelyn to direct Hargrove's executive team to terminate the employment of Troy Ainsworth, Derek Falconer, and Sylvia Beaumont, pending the outcome of the regulatory referral that Spencer Aldridge had already begun preparing. The motion passed without dissent. 3 days later, Marcus Carter returned to the 14th floor of Hargrove Financial. He went in the afternoon without announcement. He had asked Evelyn not to send advance notice. He took the elevator to the 14th floor and walked through the glass doors into the bullpen, which had the particular quality of a room still processing recent events. Slightly too quiet, slightly too careful, the kind of attention that forms when people know something has changed but are not yet certain what it means for them. He asked if the team could gather for a few minutes. They assembled in the open area near the windows, 22 people in total. Some of them Marcus recognized from his 11 days. Some he did not. Petra Okonkwo stood near the back, arms at her sides, watching him with an expression that gave nothing away. Marcus spoke for less than 10 minutes. He did not perform. He did not move around the room or use the vocabulary of motivational speeches. He stood in one place and said what there was to say. He told them who he was. He said he understood that the past several weeks had been disorienting, and that disorientation in the wake of institutional failure was reasonable. He told them that an independent HR review would begin the following week, and that its mandate was not to assess anyone's current performance, but to audit the past 18 months of performance records, promotion decisions, and project attribution on the 14th floor. He said he had reason to believe that the records as they currently stood did not accurately reflect the work that had been done by the people in this room. He said the firm was going to fix that. He paused. "I also want to say one thing that isn't procedural," he said. "There are people in this room who stayed quiet for a long time, in circumstances that made staying quiet feel like the only viable option. That kind of silence costs something. I want you to know it was noticed." He did not look specifically at Petra Okonkwo when he said this, but the people standing near her glanced at her, the way people do when something lands close to the truth. He thanked them for their time and left. The independent HR review took 3 weeks and was conducted by a firm based in Ottawa with no prior relationship to Hargrove or Alderton. The lead reviewer was a woman named Joan Whitfield, who had spent 15 years in labor relations and had the particular temperament of someone who did not find paperwork daunting. What Joan Whitfield and her team found, documented in a 94-page report submitted in late November, was systematic. Over 18 months, performance evaluations on the 14th floor had been altered in 9 documented cases. In 7 of those cases, the analyst whose work formed the substantive basis of a project had received either no credit or reduced credit in the official record. Promotion recommendations had been modified after initial submission in 4 cases, in each instance to the detriment of the original recommended employee. 2 employees had been placed on performance improvement plans following periods, during which their primary project work had been reassigned without documentation. The names in the report included Petra Okonkwo, who had been passed over for a senior analyst position that had gone to a colleague whose substantive contributions to the underlying work amounted to a single slide in a client presentation. It also included a junior analyst named Ben Forsyth, who had been placed on a performance improvement plan 6 months after completing a regulatory gap analysis that had subsequently been submitted under Troy Ainsworth's name to Hargrove's parent company board. That analysis, or a version of it, had been cited in an Alderton board presentation as evidence of Hargrove's compliance rigor. When Marcus read that section of the report, he set it down and was quiet for a long moment. In early December, Hargrove Financial held an all-staff meeting in the atrium of its Wellington Street building. It was a Thursday morning, overcast, the kind of Toronto winter day that arrives before the snow and settles into the city like a gray patience. Evelyn Carter-Strauss spoke first, briefly. She thanked the staff for their steadiness during a difficult period. She acknowledged that what the review had found was serious, and that the firm's leadership had failed in its most basic obligation to the people who worked there. She did not dress this in the language of transformation or forward momentum. She said it plainly. Then she introduced Marcus. Marcus stood at the front of the atrium with his hands in his pockets. There were perhaps 90 people in the room, sitting in chairs arranged across the polished concrete floor, some of them meeting his eyes and some of them not. He said he was not there to describe the findings of the review. They had all received the summary, and the full report was available to anyone who wanted it. He was there to describe what would happen next. 9 employees would be receiving revised performance records reflecting their actual contributions. 4 employees would be receiving retroactive promotion adjustments, with corresponding compensation changes effective the 1st of January. 2 employees who had been placed on performance improvement plans would have those plans removed from their records, with written acknowledgement from the firm. He said the compliance architecture review he had been engaged to complete would be finished by someone better suited to do it without the complications his presence had created. A team from an external advisory practice that Alderton had retained for this purpose. He said he would review their findings as a board matter rather than an operational one. He said one more thing. What happened on the 14th floor over the past 18 months was not an accident, and it was not the result of individual bad judgment. It was a system. A small group of people had built a system that extracted value from people who were doing genuine work and redirected it toward their own advancement. And the system worked because enough of the surrounding architecture, the documentation, the HR processes, the informal culture, allowed it to continue without visible interruption. He looked around the room. Systems like that require conditions in order to survive. One of those conditions is that the people being harmed do not speak, because they have correctly calculated that speaking will cost them more than staying quiet. I want to be direct about that calculation. It was a rational one given what they knew. And it is a failure of institutional design that it was rational. We are going to spend a significant amount of time and attention making sure that it becomes irrational. that people who raise concerns come out better for having raised them, not worse. The room was quiet in a way that was different from the quiet Marcus had noticed in his first days on the 14th floor. This was not watchful quiet. This was the quiet of people absorbing something they had not expected to hear said out loud. He thanked them and stepped back. Petra Okonkwo was offered the senior analyst position in the second week of December, formally and in writing, with a salary adjustment and an acknowledgement from Hargrove's new interim director of compliance, a woman named Sandra Tate, brought in from outside, that the previous decision had been improperly made. Petra took 2 days before she responded. When she did, she accepted. She did not make a statement about it, and Marcus did not ask her to. He learned of her acceptance through a brief note from Sandra Tate, which he read on a Tuesday morning over coffee in his flat near St. Lawrence Market, the winter light coming gray and flat through the east-facing windows. Ben Forsyth, the junior analyst whose regulatory work had been submitted under another name, requested a meeting with Marcus directly. Marcus agreed. They met for 40 minutes in a small conference room at Alderton's Bay Street office, and what Ben Forsyth said in that meeting was not principally about what had been taken from him. It was about the 3 other junior analysts on the floor who had experienced similar things and who had said nothing because Ben Forsyth, had said nothing, and they had taken their cue from him. Marcus listened to this for a long time. He told Ben that the review had found them, that their records were being corrected, that he did not need to carry that. Ben Forsyth nodded. He looked like someone who would carry it anyway, at least for a while, which Marcus thought was probably honest. The matter of Marcus Carter's non-disclosure, his failure to identify himself as a director of Alderton Capital when he began the Hargrove engagement, was addressed separately through the board's governance committee in January. Marcus had raised it himself before anyone else did. He sent a written memo to the chair of the governance committee, Evelyn's deputy, a deliberate and formal man named Hugh Carmichael, laying out the timeline, his reasoning, and his view of what the governance implications were. His reasoning, as stated in the memo, was this. He had been brought in to observe a firm with minimal prior knowledge of its internal dynamics. Disclosing his board relationship to Alderton would have changed the way people interacted with him, possibly in ways that would have obscured rather than illuminated what he had been asked to assess. He acknowledged that this reasoning, while not without merit, did not override the disclosure obligations he held as a director, and that a stricter interpretation of those obligations would have required him to either disclose at the outset or decline the engagement. He offered to step down from the board. Hugh Carmichael reviewed the memo. The governance committee reviewed it. There were 3 weeks of conversations that Marcus was not party to, and one that he was. In the end, the committee issued a formal finding that the non-disclosure represented a lapse in governance practice, noted the unusual circumstances, acknowledged the outcomes of the engagement, and determined that no further action was warranted. The finding was recorded. Marcus remained on the board. He did not interpret this as vindication. He interpreted it as the result that had been arrived at and moved on. In February, Marcus went to Halifax to see his daughter. Fiona Carter was in the middle of her 2nd year and had the compressed, purposeful quality of someone deep inside a thing they had chosen deliberately. They had dinner at a restaurant near the waterfront, and she asked him about Hargrove because she had followed the story through the financial press with the particular attention of someone trying to understand a practice area. He told her most of it. He left out the parts that were still in legal process. She asked him if he had known, when he took the engagement, that it might turn into something larger. He said he had suspected there was something worth finding. He had not known what it was. She asked him if he would do it differently. He thought about this. He thought about the disclosure he had not made, and the conversation with Hugh Carmichael, and about Ben Forsyth sitting in the conference room on Bay Street, saying that 3 other people had stayed quiet because he had. "I would disclose," he said, "from the beginning, and I think the outcome would have been worse." Fiona looked at him. "Not for me," he said, "for them." She considered this for a moment, then asked the question he had been waiting for her to ask, because she had always been precise about these things. Was that the right call? Marcus picked up his coffee cup. Outside the window, the Halifax harbor was dark and calm, the lights of the Dartmouth shore reflecting in long lines on the water. "I don't know," he said. "I think it was the honest one." Fiona Carter nodded slowly, in the way she had of receiving information she was not yet done with. They finished dinner. He paid. They walked for a while along the waterfront in the cold, not saying much, which had always been enough. The regulatory referral that Spencer Aldridge had prepared was accepted by the Ontario Securities Commission in March. Marcus was interviewed twice, as both a witness and in a more complicated conversation, as someone whose conduct during the engagement was itself a subject of interest. He answered every question he was asked. He provided every document he held. The investigation was ongoing as of the spring, and Marcus had been told it would likely remain so for another year at least. Troy Ainsworth's employment had been terminated. Derek Falconer's employment had been terminated. Sylvia Beaumont, whose role in the document substitution appeared to have been one of awareness rather than active participation, had resigned and retained her own counsel. Marcus did not follow the proceedings closely. He had handed what he had to the people whose job it was to carry it, and he trusted them to do that. This was not indifference. It was the kind of discipline that comes from having spent a long career, knowing which part of a problem was yours to solve, and which part belonged to someone else. On a Thursday morning in late April, Marcus Carter ran his 5 kilometers along the waterfront, came home, showered, and made coffee. He stood at the east-facing window of his flat and watched the light move across the rooftops of the market district, the old brick warehouses and the new glass towers sitting together in the particular uncomfortable coexistence of a city that had not finished deciding what it was. He thought about Petra Okonkwo and about the particular way she had stood near the back of the room on the 14th floor, arms at her sides, watching him without expression. He thought about what it cost to maintain that kind of stillness for that long, and about the specific calibration required. Not giving up, not pushing too hard, threading the needle between invisible and erased. He thought about the 11 days he had spent on that floor and how much of what had mattered he had not seen until he stopped looking for what he had expected to find. He finished his coffee. He rinsed the cup. He had a call at 9 with a policy working group at the Financial Services Regulatory Authority, which he served on in an advisory capacity and which was in the process of developing new guidance on internal reporting mechanisms for mid-sized investment firms. The guidance, if adopted, would make the calculation that Ben Forsyth and Petra Okonkwo and the others had made. The rational, self-protective calculation that silence was safer than speaking, significantly harder to justify. It would not make it impossible. Marcus understood that. He had spent enough time inside institutions to know that no document could fully replace the culture it was trying to produce. But it was the work that was his to do, and he did it the way he did most things, without announcement, without particular urgency, with the kind of patience that looks from the outside like nothing much at all.